Aboriginal Australia is the thorn in the side of the Out of Africa timeline because it refuses to behave like a late, tidy, recent chapter of a single exodus. Out of Africa loves one sacred date, 50,000 years. It is clean, it is simple, it creates a single main event, and it turns the human story into a neat explosion outward from Africa, followed by a rapid global takeover. However, Australia behaves like what it really is, a deep-time, continent-sized record of early modern humanity, with enough complexity, variation, and early presence to make the 50,000-year date look like a modern storytelling convenience, rather than a serious historical framework. However, numerous archaeological and genetic studies prove that humans were in Australia and Papua before 50,000 years ago. The Out of Africa regime did not merely disagree with Australian prehistory, it declared war on it. And the battlefield is not subtle. The core maneuver is blunt. When Australia produces evidence older than 50,000 years, the model does not adjust itself to the evidence. Instead, it attacks the evidence. It says the dates must be wrong, the layers must be mixed, the artifacts must be displaced, or the interpretations must be mistaken. In other words, the Out of Africa 50,000-year narrative does exactly what collapsing paradigms always do. It turns itself into a tribunal where anything that contradicts the sacred date is automatically treated as guilty. Australia is not the one escalating, the theory is. Because if Australia was genuinely occupied by 65,000 years ago, then the famous single late burst out of Africa is no longer a triumphal march. It becomes a messy sequence of movements, pauses, pulses, and deep regional histories, exactly the sort of complexity the 50,000-year myth was invented to erase. This is why the Australian debate is the exact mirror of Clovis First. That is the psychological structure we see again in Australia. The moment archaeologists say, 65,000, out of Africa, thinking does not ask, what does this imply? It says, impossible, therefore wrong. The timeline becomes a border wall. The site that triggers this war most visibly is Majid Bebe in northern Australia, which has been published with evidence consistent with human occupation around 65,000 years ago, based on optically stimulated luminescence dating and stratigraphic work. The Out of Africa 50,000-year version of history cannot survive that date intact. So the war plan becomes predictable. Don't revise the model. Invalidate the date. Critiques focus relentlessly on whether the deposit was disturbed, whether artifacts moved downward, whether older sediments were mixed with younger cultural material. Even when the excavation team directly addresses these concerns in the Nature paper, the larger ideological reaction remains the same. If it's older than 50,000 years, something must be wrong. And crucially, this hostility is not merely confined to technical archaeological critiques. In recent years, it has escalated into something even more revealing. Genetic model arguments deployed explicitly to refute the early Australian archaeology. A 2025 study framed around Neanderthal DNA and modeling directly challenged the 65,000-year arrival timeline, implying humans reached Australia much less than 50,000 years ago. Archaeology magazines summarized this emerging friction. Genetic modeling challenging early arrival while the archaeological record still argues for older occupation, calling for interdisciplinary caution rather than annihilation of the archaeology. The 50,000-year date comes from a narrow set of studies on early Europeans' fossils in Germany, dating to around 45,000 years ago, that came to the conclusion that Neanderthal interbreeding happened between 45,000 to 49,000 years ago. The leader of the study speculated that the interbreeding happened somewhere in the Near East and involved just 100 to 200 Neanderthals, mostly females, interbreeding with a small group of recent out-of-Africa migrants over a period of 1,500 years. Genetics, often treated as the supreme judge that can overrule archaeology, does not actually protect the 50,000-year line. Genetic dates are not fossils. They are statistical constructions built from assumptions about mutation rates, generation times, population structure, bottlenecks, and gene flow, and changing any one of these inputs can shift the output by thousands of years. That is why geneticists routinely disagree with one another. Two teams can analyze the same broad human history and still produce different best-fit timelines because the results are fundamentally model-dependent, not direct measurements. In that sense, genetics does not deliver a single authoritative exodus date. It delivers competing probability narratives, and many of them quietly strain against the neat 50,000-year boundary, even while the public-facing story pretends the number is settled. This is the key point you want made loud. Out of Africa is not cautiously evaluating uncertain dates. It is deploying a strategic logic. Anything older than the model's preferred main dispersal window is treated as error by definition. That is not neutral science. That is not an open hypothesis. That is a doctrine defending itself. Because if Aboriginal Australia is truly deep time, if occupation begins around 65,000 or earlier, then the out of Africa burst narrative becomes cartoonish. The model asks us to believe that humans exited Africa, crossed all of Asia, entered Wallacea, mastered open water crossings, arrived in Sahul, and then spread across a continent so fast that they reached interior ecological systems and developed stable cultural traditions almost immediately. It turns the first Australians into supernatural sprinters. It compresses prehistory into a highlight reel. Now bring in Lake Mungo, because Lake Mungo does not look like the first footprints of desperate pioneers. It looks like a society with ritual structure. Lake Mungo contains burials such as Mungo Lady and Mungo Man, dated broadly to around 42,000 years, depending on method and debate. Mungo Lady's cremation and burial practice implies symbolism, tradition, and social continuity. That matters because Mungo is not a coastal stepping stone site. It is inland southern Australia. So the out of Africa 50,000-year model is forced into absurd geometry. People supposedly arrive on the far northern edge of Sahul and then rapidly colonize the interior and the south in a geological blink. It is not impossible in some abstract sense, but combined with everything else, boats, water crossings, ecology shifts, and culture, it becomes too clean to be true. Even more corrosive for out of Africa is the morphological picture. Early remains like those associated with Lake Mungo are often described as relatively gracile, especially compared with later robust Australian remains. These younger fossils, such as Kubel Creek, are much too robust to have come from the same population and probably represent a surviving archaic lineage related to Denisovans. This doesn't mean that Aboriginal Australians are archaic any more than Neanderthals in Europe mean that Europeans are the descendants of Neanderthals. Losing the title of first also doesn't mean it diminishes 50,000 years of history, any more than Europeans claiming to have ancestral claim to Europe, even though they were not first. Genetic evidence in Papua and fossil evidence in southern Australia both suggest that these archaic survived until around 15,000 years ago in these refugia. The deeper point is that Australia shows too much early morphological diversity, too early over too wide a geographic space, to be comfortably explained by descent from a tiny, late bottleneck population, leaving Africa at 50,000 years ago. If all non-Africans descend from a small group bursting outward at that time, then Australia, isolated and remote, should preserve a narrow slice of variation. Instead, it preserves a wide and internally differentiated human range. That is precisely what you would expect if Australia is not merely a late endpoint, but part of a deep dispersal history with multiple movements and local consolidation over time. The human fossil record of southern Australia provides some of the most compelling evidence that the simplistic out-of-Africa replacement model is no longer tenable. The earliest Australians do not form a narrow, uniform, recently bottlenecked group. They form a spectrum, an astonishing range of cranial structures and facial morphologies that appear from the earliest layers of human occupation and continue into the Holocene. The most striking aspect of this pattern is that many of the most robust and anatomically unusual skulls are found in southern Australia, thousands of miles from the proposed northern entry point into Sahul. Their presence so far south, and in such late contexts, strongly implies that Denisovan-related groups, or Denisovan-derived hybrids, survived in Australia far longer than previously imagined. The genetic evidence that Denisovans persisted in Papua until at least 15,000 years ago strongly reinforces this interpretation. By framing hybridization and diversity as a threat to Aboriginal identity, defenders of the out-of-Africa model created a powerful rhetorical shield. They could dismiss any inconvenient evidence while appearing moralistic. They could say, "We must be careful because suggesting older humans in Australia could be used politically against Aboriginal people." But this was never about protecting Aboriginals. This was about protecting the out-of-Africa theory. The model relied on portraying Aboriginal Australians as recent arrivals from a single African migration. Any deviation from this narrative shifted authority away from the institutions that built the theory. Indeed, when the fossil and genetic records are read together, the simplest, most parsimonious conclusion is that Australia was not settled by a single homogeneous wave of anatomically modern humans, but rather by a structured, diverse human population that included deeply divergent Denisovan-related ancestries that continued to shape Aboriginal Australians for tens of thousands of years. So when Out of Africa claims that any evidence older than 50,000 years must be wrong, they are not defending truth. They are defending a schedule. They are defending a neat global narrative whose emotional appeal is that it is simple and totalizing. A single exodus, a single bottleneck, a single replacement. And Australia breaks it because Australia forces the model to do something humiliating. It must either accept early and complex dispersal, or it must claim that Australian archaeology and inland burial culture are basically mirages caused by dating error. That is why your framing is exactly right. Out of Africa declared war on Australian prehistory the moment it decided that the timeline is not allowed to move. It did what Clovis first did. It transformed a hypothesis into a border checkpoint. Anything stamped older than 50,000 years gets rejected at the desk, not because the stamp is fake, but because it threatens the empire. The Out of Africa regime has effectively drawn a hard line in the sand 50,000 years ago, and it is not just a scientific line, it is a political one. Step over it and the tone changes instantly. You are no longer pushing the field forward. You are controversial, problematic, premature, accused of misinterpreting sediments, overstating dates, or not understanding the genetics. In practice, the 50,000-year line functions like a manifesto, because if a site, a burial, or a dispersal route is convincingly older than 50,000 years, the entire Clean Out of Africa narrative begins to unravel. The truth revealed by these fossils is simple. The Out of Africa model cannot account for the human story of Australia. Only a model that embraces hybridization, deep structure, and long-term survival of Denisovan-related lineages can explain both the genetics and the remarkable morphological diversity of early Australians. And only such a model fully honors the deep antiquity, biological richness, and profound connection of Aboriginal Australians to their land, a connection rooted not in a single recent migration, but in the enduring legacy of multiple ancient human histories converging uniquely in Sahul. When we examine the rhetoric, it becomes clear that the anxiety about hybridization had nothing to do with Aboriginal people and everything to do with academic power. If Aboriginal Australians descended partly from earlier hominins in Sahul, then the long-protected simplicity of the Out of Africa story dissolves in complexity. By claiming that hybridization invalidated Aboriginal identity, defenders of the model attempted to make the scientific challenge politically and ethically untouchable. It was a sophisticated maneuver. Use indigenous rights as a protective barrier around scientific dogma. But this moral authority has now crumbled. Thanks for watching.